Did you know that the D-pad and the joystick share a common ancestor? Or that consoles and controllers used to be one and the same? Have you ever wondered how modern video game controllers came to be? Today I'm going to be tracing the design elements of controllers from the 1970s through to today. This is, speaking of, the evolution of video game controllers. The very first home video game console release was called the Magnavox Odyssey. It was released in 1972 and the controller consisted of one reset button and 3 knobs. It has very little in common with the layout of modern video game controllers and won't play a huge part in the design evolution to come, but it is important to mention as the inception of home gaming. It may not seem like it, but modern controllers began in what I call the knobs and dials era of gaming. This set us down the path that would lead to today's controllers. The knobs and dials era of gaming was reflective of the 70s technology it was born out of. TVs at the time were operated with dials and knobs, so of course the Coleco Telstar of 1976 would operate with knobs and dials as well. It was just an extension of the technology around it. The Coleco Telstar had 3 games installed on it, all of which were just different versions of Pong. Video games were not on separate cartridges at this time, and the controller was built into this console. This is also where, having no existing repertoire to draw from and iterate upon, video game designers would mimic phones and television remotes of the era with things like Intellivision Entertainment and the Atari 5200 Super System. But seeing as how this style of design won't have much impact on the controllers to come, I'm gonna leave them here in the decade they were born. When looking back at the history and evolution of video game controllers, I think a lot of people miss the impact that arcade games had on design. Arcade games were actually where the joystick was first used in video games, introduced in Sega's 1968 arcade game Missile. Though joysticks were invented in the 20s for aircraft and used throughout the following decades in various forms of steering control, it wasn't until the Atari 2600 in 1977 that the joystick made the leap into home console gaming, where they would be used and abandoned and brought back before becoming a staple of the modern controller. The next huge leap in controller layouts came with Nintendo. Today, Nintendo is kind of viewed as a lagging platform. The Switch was out of date and underpowered when it released in 2017, and 7 years later it can't run many of the heavy games of today. Now, that's not to say Nintendo is a slouch. They've clearly dominated the handheld market. They've even nearly had a monopoly on it until recently when they created their own competition with the popularity of the Switch. But in the 80s and 90s, Nintendo was a leader in the home console industry and would revolutionize the controller. Case in point, they were the first to create a recognizable, by modern standards, game controller with the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1983. Though incredibly simplistic by today's standards, the controller consisted of a joystick without the stick, otherwise known as a D-pad or directional pad, 2 buttons borrowed from arcade games at the time, which Nintendo labeled B and A respectively, and a start and select button. Though the controller was incredibly sharp and angular, it revolutionized home console controller from knobs, individual joysticks, and phone button layouts. This leads us to Sega, who would invent the next part of the modern controller, the grips. In 1988, they launched the Sega Genesis, which included the first controller with ergonomics considered in its design. They would also go on to release a 6-button edition, which would have more impact on modern controllers than you might think. Nintendo would take note of Sega's ergonomics, though not the grip specifically, when they launched the follow-up to the NES, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System of 1990, which would have a similar controller to the NES in appearance, but would completely change the layout yet again. This time the layout included 4 buttons rather than 2, adding X and Y, thereby completing the standard 4-button array that we know and use today. They would take things another step further by adding the first L and R shoulder buttons to the top of the controller. Sony would then come along with the PlayStation and its controller, combining the comfort of the Sega Genesis grips while enforcing the soon-to-be standard button layout of the SNES, and even adding a second row of shoulder buttons, L2 and R2. Sony would change the ABXY labeling of the buttons to X for yes, circle for no, triangle for point of view, and square for menu. You can really see the straightforward path from this first iteration to modern Sony controllers, but we're still missing something essential. That reminds me, what's Nintendo up to in 1996? Oh, nothing much, just bringing back the joystick with the N64. It was also Nintendo's first attempt at ergonomic grips, which was something, iconic to say the least. But it does implement one important feature of modern controllers, the joystick, which was essential to the 3D-ification of video games at the time. The N64 controller's button layout was also reminiscent of that 6-button design from Sega, which we'll see again, maybe in an unexpected place. When the PlayStation 2 came out, Sony would combine all of these scattered features into one controller that would become the basis for all modern controllers moving forward. In the DualShock controller, we find the ergonomic grips of the Sega Genesis, the 4-button layout of the SNES, the D-pad from the NES, the SNES's shoulder buttons with Sony's added second set, and now, for the first time, 2 joysticks in the center of the controller, one to control the character and one to control the camera. They even made them clickable, creating L3 and R3 for the first time. They also added vibration, hence the name DualShock. The DualShock controller is so foundational to modern video game controllers that you can still play most games released today on this controller from 1997. Although this is where controller design becomes much more iterative, it is not where controller design ends. Xbox is up next, bursting onto the scene in 2001 with the first Xbox controller called the Duke. Akin to the GameCube, they would swap the location of the left joystick with the D-pad, which would become a staple of their controller design. And hey, what's this? Microsoft has brought back that 6-button layout that we saw earlier, with the addition of the black and white buttons above the standard 4. They would also invert the label of A, B, and X and Y from Nintendo's controllers, which I actually think makes a lot more sense. In 2005, the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 controllers would turn their logos into buttons, something that was born out of necessity of the dashboard and multimedia systems that came to be in the late aughts. And in the ever-increasing social media landscape of the 2010s, the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One controller would introduce screen capture buttons, morphed from the select buttons of controllers past. Sony would also introduce a touch bar, something underutilized at the time, perhaps even still, but a meaningful addition. We are now firmly in the era of modern video game controllers. The DualSense controller of the PS5 added haptic feedback, a huge step up from the previous vibration that was merely an offset weight that spun. If you've never experienced it, the new haptic feedback is crazy. You can feel raindrops hitting the controller, or the terrain that your character is running on. They also added tension triggers, which can be implemented in more than just gunplay, such as having the trigger mimic the shifting of a car transmission in Cyberpunk 2077. To my hands and my style of gameplay, the PS5 controller is the most comfortable modern controller. I'm a fan of the aligned joysticks over that of Xbox and Nintendo's offset sticks, and the controller fits my hand better than Xbox's wide berth. This is today's top-of-the-line standard controller, and it wouldn't have been possible without every iteration that came before it. There's also been an entire slew of gimmick controllers that I've skipped over here, such as gun controllers, which are nearly as old as controllers themselves, the Wii Remote, steering wheels, Xbox Kinect, and PlayStation Move, the last of which play into modern VR controllers. There's guitars and drum sets and dance pads. There's accessibility controllers. There's also the Wii U, which was essentially a prototype to the Switch. But when talking about the standard controller design of today, these are another story. Although many design choices of controllers past would lead to dead ends, it's inescapable that we wouldn't have modern day video game controllers without the litany of experimentation and revolutionary designs that came before. Thanks for watching.